Hey everyone, welcome back to our second episode of 30 Days of Code. For today, we're doing a challenge that is regarding data types. And we will be learning how to create our own variables, assign them to an input from the console, and do some data transformation with them. And in this case, we'll be using the plus operator to do some data transformation. So in this case, for this question, we are given three variables. We're given I, which is an integer, D, which is a float variable, and S, which is a string variable. And in this case, we are supposed to create a second corresponding integer, float, and string variable. And we are supposed to read in the input from the console and assign them to each of their respective variables. And once we're done, we're supposed to add the original I integer variable with the corresponding input from the console and do the same for the float as well as for the string. So let's get started. So the first step is to declare the second integer, float, and string variables. So to make it easier, I'm going to follow the same convention as what we see on line 1 to 3. So we'll first define the second integer. I'll give it I_2. And in this case, I'll give it an optional type hint of exactly what type this variable is supposed to have. In Python, we don't enforce type hints, but it is always a good thing to do that because as you work with more developers, the communication overhead scales quadratically. So we try not to do that. We try not to skip type hints. So I'll just be prompting you in these challenges to do that. So I'll do the same for the float variable as well. This is of type float, and S, which is of type string. And once we are done defining the variables, we are ready to start reading and saving this stuff into the variables. So as we see in the sample input, we have 3 lines, and the input function that we learned from the previous exercise reads in each line as a output from that input function that we have. So what this means is if we want to get the first line in the sample input into I2, we can do I2 equals to input. And input, in this case, will read in the first line over here. But this input function returns the red text in string format. So it's not really an integer. So we will have to cast it into an integer. And we can do that by wrapping it with the integer function like this. Actually, in this case, it really just casts it into an integer. So next, we'll do the same for D and S, and it's pretty much the same thing right here. We will just assign this to float input. We read the second line using the input function and convert it into a float. And we also do the same for the S over here as well. In this case, we don't have to cast it because the type of this third line is already a string, so we don't have to do anything. And once we're done, we're ready to print the sum of both the integer variables I and I2 on a new line. So let's do that with I plus I_2. This will be the sum of both integer variables. And we'll just have to do the same for the remaining floats and strings. So let's do D plus D_2. And in this case, we will concatenate the string variables S and S_2 as well. And just like that, we're done. Let's run the code. And we pass the test cases. Let's submit the code and we pass all the test cases. And that's it for the second challenge. So to recap the concepts that we just learned here, we learned how we can define our own variables like this. And we are allowed to put in optional type hints to make it clearer what types these variables are. We also learned how to use the same input function we saw in day 0, and we also learned how to cast this string that is from input into their respective types. If you want an integer, remember to use the int function, wrap it with the int function, and it would just be casted into an integer. And finally, we did some basic data transformation using the plus operator. We used the plus operator to just add 2 integers together, 2 floats, and 2 strings. And that's pretty much it. If you find this useful or you have any comments, or if I have made any mistake, feel free to leave it in the comments. And we will see you in the next day 2 challenge. See you next time.